This video provides a brief outline of how adoption has been legislated and practiced in Australia. We examine the past, the present, and considerations for the future. Adoption is a highly contested topic, in Australia and globally. When considered broadly, adoption as the transfer of a child from their birth family into the care of another has occurred for as long as people have lived in Australia. Aboriginal families take in children in need of care in their community, as have families in the early years of white settlement. Things began to change around the 1840s. Newspaper advertisements from around this time show the beginning of an exchange of children between strangers, both people wanting to adopt and parents unable to keep their children placed advertisements. These were often private arrangements with a transfer of money and were not authorised by law. Legal adoption was introduced in the 1920s as the demand for adopted children increased. They were intended to provide a clean break from birth parents. These have become known as closed adoptions. In these, the child's original birth certificate was kept sealed, and a modified birth certificate was produced. This stated that the child had been born to the adoptive parents. It was considered a means of providing adoptive parents with security and preventing birth family contact. In Australia's adoption history, there are two notable groups who experienced a great deal of trauma, loss, and threats to their sense of identity. These are the stolen generations and the forced adoptions. Their negative experiences and the consequences of these adoption practices were uncovered in parliamentary inquiries conducted within the last 20 years. From 1910 to 1970, it is estimated that the numbers of Indigenous children removed from their families and communities ranged from 1 in 3 to 1 in 10, depending on the state or territory. A national inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, kinship group, and communities collected over 500 individual testimonies from members of the Stolen Generation, Indigenous organisations, and other groups. The Bringing Them Home report was released in 1997. It revealed the extent of the pain, loss, and grief experienced by the communities.
All of those things were designed to take the Aboriginality out of Aboriginal kids because there was a belief that particularly Darwinist type beliefs that the only way that these children would survive was for them to be civilised, and that meant destroying the culture that they came from, trying to turn them into different shades of white, which never worked, of course, and has resulted in enormous grief and trauma to Aboriginal society, and that's ongoing. It's what we see today. Much of its foundation is in these past laws and policies and practices that took children away and attempted the destruction of their culture.
During the 1970s, a community movement initiated by Aboriginal and Islander child care agencies grew into the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Child Placement Principle. This principle has been introduced into legislation and policy across all Australian states and territories. It aims to enhance and preserve children's connection to family and community. From the 1950s and 60s, adoption laws and practices were influenced by social work. During this time, social workers were given responsibilities to decide which babies could be adopted and who was suitable to adopt. While the stated aim was to find the perfect family for babies, what it really reflected were the demands of adoptive parents for children and the pressure on unwed mothers to relinquish their child.
So-called unwanted baby really is wanted somewhere.
I think it's so important that a baby be brought up in a normal two-parent home where there's discipline and emotional security as well as financial security.
Findings from the Senate inquiry and research indicated how forced adoption practices reflected society's responses to illegitimacy, infertility, and impoverishment. It highlighted the wide-ranging impacts and ripple effects of adoption felt by children who were adopted, mothers, and other family members. Grief and loss were experienced and found to be traumatic. Adoptions peaked between 1971 to 1972, with 9,798 children adopted across the country. Then a decline began. This was for a few reasons. The increased availability of abortion, contraception, family planning services, and sole parent income support led to fewer babies in Australia being put up for adoption. Social attitudes towards single mothers also became decreasingly negative. In the 1980s, emphasis shifted from placing infants to providing homes for older children, negotiating inter-country adoptions, and responding to requests for information about past closed adoptions. By the 1990s, many foreign countries had closed or limited their inter-country adoption programs. During this time, there was a push for adoption to no longer be viewed as a service for couples wishing to adopt, but as a service for children, with their welfare being key. Another shift during the 1990s was the initiation of adoption from out-of-home care. Research emerging from the US and UK in the 1980s detailed the challenges with children who drifted in and out of the care system and indicated the need for stability in care. The first adoptions from out-of-home care by Barnardos in 1985 were a response to this research and a focus on permanency planning for children. Within Australian states, there were moves to amend laws. These moves were to allow sealed adoption records to be opened and to allow contact between birth and adoptive families. The findings of the national inquiries on past adoption practices pointed to widespread suffering, neglect, and mistreatment of children on a large scale. There were calls for the Commonwealth to issue a formal statement acknowledging the nation's role in the suffering of children and their families. In February of 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered the national apology to the stolen generations. In March of 2013, Prime Minister Julia Gillard delivered the national apology for forced adoptions. Today, there are a range of support services available for those affected by past adoption practices. These include face-to-face support, casework, counselling, records tracing, assistance with reunion, healing activities, small grants to build sector capacity, raising awareness, and providing a database of stories by those affected which can be accessed by future generations. In recent times, there are less than 500 adoptions per year. About half are inter-country, around a third are no-in child adoptions by foster carers and step-parents, and less than 10% are infants who are adopted by strangers. It has been argued that the cultural legacy of past adoption practices contributes to a reticence for adoption in the present day among workers. The latest figures for adoption in Australia, finalised in the 2016 to 2017 period, show that 246 of the total 315 adoptions were for Australian children, and that of the 143 carer adoptions, 131 were in New South Wales alone. In New South Wales, there is clear policy and framework as to when adoption can be considered and what conditions need to be met to adopt a child in care. Consent can be dispensed with on the basis of the child's established relationship with the carer. This provision recognises the child's need for a secure attachment. Adoption is not a preferred permanency option for children in other states. Victorian law provides a form of placement known as permanent care. After 2 years of fostering children, carers can apply to become their legal guardians until they reach the age of 18.
Was adoption ever an option for you? I don't know if adoption was ever spoken about with my circumstance. In Queensland, adoption isn't a very big thing with children in care. It's only just being thought of now. So we're trying, those that have been through the care system are helping create foundation to try and help the government organise and make rules about when adoption can be put into place with children in care.
From 2012, a report on the outcomes of public consultation on the child protection reforms entitled A Safe Home for Life was released. This report spoke of a need for sweeping reforms to the New South Wales child protection system, including the streamlining of the open adoption practices. The main change was the inclusion of the permanent placement principles. These prioritised open adoption over parental responsibility to the minister until 18 years of age for children where there is no realistic possibility of restoration, and when a suitable kin, relative, or other appropriate person cannot be allocated parental responsibility. These reforms also introduced permanency planning timeframes for when decisions are made about whether restoration is feasible. In 2015, the New South Wales Government commissioned an independent review into current out-of-home care practices and policies in New South Wales. This is also known as the Tune Report. The Tune Report found that the long-term and intergenerational needs of children and young people were not being effectively met, that there was an overemphasis on crisis prevention and reduction in immediate harm at the expense of interventions which had more long-term goals. This was especially true for children of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage. There was a need for a whole-of-system reform. In March of 2017, major changes to the child protection system were announced. The Their Futures Matter reforms responded to the Tune Report. The whole-of-system reforms are based on an investment approach. The reforms aim to invest in effective, evidence-based services to prevent child abuse and keep families together, rather than continue allocating spending to crisis-orientated, out-of-home care services. The reforms also aim to find stable and permanent homes for children who are unable to return home after all efforts are made to support birth parents. The New South Wales Government also introduced the Permanency Support Program in 2017 to improve the accountability of out-of-home care services. This is a new outcomes-based contract and funding system. It incentivizes non-government providers who manage half of all out-of-home care placements in the state to find all children a permanent home within the 2-year maximum deadline after entering care. The Permanency Support Program also aims to ensure cultural safety and help Aboriginal children remain connected to their families, communities, and country. Moving into the future, there is a need to consider the trends related to adoption policy in Australia. A parliamentary inquiry into local adoption was launched in March of 2018.
There have been more than 100 submissions to the inquiry to date. The Department of Social Services admits harmful past policies and practices, including forced adoption and the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, are just some of the reasons behind a relatively low adoption rate.
We would never ever want to repeat those mistakes of the past of forcing adults to give up their children.
The Parliamentary Committee has heard emotional evidence on tales of adoption. Its main task will be to finalise a report with recommendations likely to be handed down towards the end of the year.
In May of this year, 2018, Adopt Change announced that it was to be the provider of a new New South Wales Government program, My Family Forever, and seeks to provide recruitment, training and support for carers, guardians and adoptive parents to address the growing number of children in out-of-home care in New South Wales. Children and young people will be matched with carers who can best support their needs. A culturally sensitive strategy will be put in place to recruit and train Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander carers. So, as an overview, Australia has a particularly controversial history of adoption practices. This history may have contributed to reluctance for public debate and discourse on open adoption. As best summarised in a symposium on adoption, fostering, permanent care and beyond, rethinking policy and practice on out-of-home care for children in Australia,